Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are stepping back into the early 4th century, into a world both familiar and strange, a world of marble cities and quiet villages, of power and fragility, of gods many and gods forgotten. To understand Constantine, we must first understand the empire into which he was born. The Roman Empire at this time stretched farther than the eye could imagine. To the north were forests heavy with mist, where the edges of empire brushed against Germanic tribes. To the east were deserts where the heat shimmered, and where the rival Persians pressed at the borders. To the south, the green valley of the Nile carried grain to feed distant cities. To the west, the waves of the Atlantic crashed against the edges of the known world. The empire was vast, but to those who lived within it, it felt both endless and immediate. Roads carried its presence into every town, soldiers bore its authority into every village, and coins stamped with the emperor's face reminded all of who ruled. Yet for all its size, the empire was not at peace. The days of Augustus and long stability were far behind. In the 3rd century, emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Armies crowned their generals as rulers, only to see them defeated months later. Civil wars broke out again and again, leaving fields burned and cities weakened. Some emperors reigned only for a year, or even a few weeks before being replaced. To the people who lived through it, Rome was still mighty, but it no longer felt unshakable. Religion filled this world, binding together its daily rhythms. In the marketplaces of Rome, one might hear the cries of merchants mingling with the chants of priests as smoke rose from altars. Temples stood in every city, their steps polished by centuries of sandals, their columns tall and gleaming. Offerings of wine and oil, of incense and animals were made constantly, for the gods of Rome were seen as guardians of order and success. To neglect them was to invite disaster. Above all stood the emperor, whose image was honored not only as a ruler, but as a figure with divine connection. Statues of Caesar, of Augustus, of Diocletian were set in stone across the empire. In villages, small shrines to the emperor stood beside wells and crossroads. To pour out a libation before his image was not only an act of loyalty, but of safety. To refuse was to seem rebellious, even treasonous. And yet, among all of these shrines and altars, another faith quietly spread. It did not demand temples of marble or sacrifices of bulls. It gathered not in crowded forums, but in houses, courtyards, and underground tombs. It spoke not of many gods, but of one God, and of his Son who had been crucified in a faraway province 3 centuries earlier. These were the Christians. To outsiders they seemed strange, even dangerous. They refused to honor the emperor's image. They would not burn incense to Jupiter or Mars. They spoke of loyalty to Christ above all else. Rumors grew that they were atheists because they denied the old gods, that they were disloyal because they would not join the public sacrifices. In times of trouble, when a plague swept through a city, when the armies were defeated, when the harvest failed, blame often fell on them. Perhaps the gods are angry, people whispered, because the Christians refused to honor them. And so persecution came. Sometimes it was light, little more than a fine or a confiscation of property. At other times it was fierce. Christians were brought before governors and asked to sacrifice. If they refused, they might be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. In Rome, in Carthage, in Antioch, and beyond, many died publicly, torn by beasts in arenas or struck down by swords. Crowds watched, some jeering, some strangely moved.
for it was said that many Christians faced death not with fear but with calm singing hymns, even as flames rose or as lions approached. The great persecution begun under Diocletian and Galerius had only recently ended when Constantine's story began. Churches had been destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy imprisoned. Across the empire, the faithful had been forced into hiding. And yet, for all the violence, the church did not vanish. Instead, it grew. New converts came quietly, drawn by the courage of those who would not deny their Lord. The blood of martyrs, as one writer said, became the seed of the church. Imagine a city in these years. By day, the forum bustled, with traders selling grain and cloth, with magistrates pronouncing judgments. Smoke rose from the great altar, where bulls were sacrificed to Jupiter. Children played in narrow alleys, their shouts echoing off stone walls. And then, as evening came and the city quieted, a different gathering formed. In a modest house, a small group of Christians entered quietly, one by one. A candle flickered in the corner. A scroll was unrolled and read aloud, words of Paul, perhaps, or a psalm. Bread was broken, wine poured, prayers whispered. Outside, the night was still. Inside, hope glowed. Two worlds coexisted, close but separate. The empire of marble and might, and the community of faith and quiet devotion. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, temples adorned with gold, sacrifices offered by priests in white robes, festivals that filled the streets with music and dance. On the other, gatherings of men and women who called one another brother and sister, who remembered the poor, who prayed for their enemies, who believed the crucified one had risen. To many Romans, the Christians were too few to matter. To others, they were a threat to the order of society. To the Christians themselves, they were simply a family, bound together by faith stronger than death. This was the world Constantine was born into. He was not yet the great emperor of history, not yet the figure who would see visions and build cities. He was a young man in a fractured empire, where civil war was constant and where Christianity was still seen as dangerous. He grew up in the tension between these two realities, the grandeur of Rome with its ancient gods and the quiet resilience of a faith that refused to die. And so, before his story unfolds, before we see him march to battle, before we hear of the vision of the cross, before we walk the streets of Constantinople, let us hold this picture in our minds. The empire is mighty, but unstable. Its rulers powerful, but often insecure. Its gods honored, but its people restless. And within this empire, in homes and catacombs, in courtyards and villages, a new faith breathes steadily, awaiting the moment when the empire itself will bow before the cross. To understand the man who would one day change the empire, we must first look at the boy he once was. Constantine was born around the year 272 in the city of Nicaea, in the province of Moesia, today a place known as Niš in Serbia. It was not Rome, not a grand capital, but a provincial town along the empire's northern frontier. The land there was rugged, with rolling hills, forests, and rivers that carried traders and soldiers alike. It was a place where the empire pressed up against the edge of the unknown, where Roman roads met barbarian lands. His father was Constantius Chlorus, a capable general who rose steadily through the ranks of the Roman army. His mother was Helena, remembered later as a woman of humble origins. Some said she had once worked in an inn, others that she was the daughter of a stable keeper. Whatever her beginnings, she carried a quiet strength that would remain with her son all his life. Later, when Constantine was emperor, Helena herself would be honored as Augusta, and she would journey to Jerusalem to seek out the holy places of Christ. But in these early years, she was simply a mother, raising her son in the shifting world of the late empire. Young Constantine grew up watching soldiers. The empire's frontiers were never still. Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine and the Danube. Raids broke out suddenly. Forts dotted the borders, their towers rising above rivers, their gates echoing with the tramp of boots. To be the son of a general was to live close to this rhythm. The clatter of armor, the neigh of horses, the sight of standards carried into camp. Constantine's childhood was not one of idle luxury, but of discipline, movement, and the constant presence of the military. When he was old enough, Constantine was sent east to serve at the court of Emperor Diocletian. There, in Nicomedia, on the coast of Asia Minor, he entered a world far different from the frontier towns of his youth. Nicomedia was a splendid city, with marble streets, statues in its squares, and the great palace of the emperor overlooking the sea. Here, Constantine learned the ways of power. He studied military tactics, but also the arts of speech, diplomacy, and law. He observed the ceremonies of the court, the bowing before the emperor, the golden robes, the rituals that surrounded power in Rome. The empire at this time was governed by what was called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Diocletian, seeking stability after the chaos of endless civil wars, had divided authority among 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. Each ruled a part of the empire, east and west, north and south. In theory, it was a system of balance, of order. In practice, it was fragile, dependent on loyalty and cooperation that did not always last. Constantine grew up within this system, watching closely as alliances formed and rivalries sharpened. In Nicomedia, he also witnessed the Great Persecution. In the year 303, Diocletian issued edicts against the Christians. Churches were torn down, scriptures burned, and believers imprisoned. Constantine, though not yet emperor, could not have failed to see the suffering this caused. He may have watched as soldiers dragged Christians to trial, as homes were searched, as families mourned in silence. He was not yet a Christian himself, but he carried these images with him, memories of a faith that endured under pressure, memories of cruelty that would shape his later choices. Constantine was tall, strong, and quick to learn. He gained respect not only as the son of Constantius, but as a man of ability in his own right. He rode with the cavalry, drilled with the infantry, and took part in campaigns across Asia and along the Danube. He saw battle first-hand, the clash of shields, the weight of armor, the sound of trumpets across the field. These experiences hardened him, gave him confidence, and marked him as a leader who could be trusted in war. But he was also cautious. He knew that in the world of Roman politics, talent was not always enough. Many a promising commander had been cut down by jealousy, by intrigue, by betrayal. Constantine moved carefully, earning favor where he could, avoiding open enmity when possible. He watched, he waited, he learned. His relationship with his father remained close. Constantius had risen to become Caesar in the west, ruling parts of Gaul and Britain. When the time came, Constantine sought permission to join him. The journey west was long, across mountains and plains, through cities filled with rumor and uncertainty. Along the way, he saw again the breadth of the empire, farms stretching into the distance, towns huddled behind walls, legions drilling in camps beside rivers. Each step reminded him of the vast world he was destined to shape. At last, he reached his father's side, joining him in campaigns along the frontiers of Britain. Together they marched against the Picts in the north, crossing wild lands where Roman roads ended in windswept hills. The army trusted Constantius, and in time they came to trust his son as well. Constantine fought with courage, earning loyalty not by command alone, but by sharing in the hardships of the men. Cold nights, long marches, uncertain battles. When Constantius died at York in 306, the soldiers turned immediately to Constantine. They raised him on their shields, hailed him as Augustus, and proclaimed him emperor in the West. It was the beginning of a long and contested path, but in that moment the boy from Naissus, the son of a general and a woman of humble birth, became a ruler. Looking back, it is clear that his youth prepared him for what was to come. The discipline of the military camps gave him strength. The intrigues of Diocletian's court taught him patience. The sight of Christian suffering gave him sympathy, or at least awareness, of a faith that endured when others thought it would fade. He was shaped by both the sword and the scroll, by the frontier and the palace, by the old gods and the new faith. This was the young Constantine, soldier, student, son. He had not yet seen the vision of the cross, not yet built the Basilicas, not yet founded a city that would bear his name. But already the outlines of the man were clear. He was ambitious, disciplined, cautious, and bold. The empire around him was fractured, yet he stood ready to claim it. And so, as his father's body was laid to rest and the legions cheered his name, Constantine stepped forward. The boy of Naissus was gone. In his place stood a man who would change the world. When Constantine stepped into the world of politics and power, Rome was no longer the empire of a single ruler. The 3rd century had taught the Romans a bitter lesson, that one man alone could not easily hold together so vast and restless a realm. Civil wars had torn through the provinces, rivals had risen and fallen like waves, and emperors had been proclaimed and assassinated with startling speed. In response, Emperor Diocletian had sought a solution. His answer was the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. In this system, the empire was divided into halves. At the top stood 2 senior emperors, called Augusti. Beneath them were 2 junior emperors, called Caesars. Each ruled a portion of the empire, each commanded armies, and each was meant to succeed in orderly fashion when the time came. In theory, it was a brilliant design. No single frontier would be left unguarded. No single man could dominate the others, and stability would be secured by balance. But in practice, the arrangement was delicate. Ambition, rivalry, and pride still stirred in the hearts of men. The empire was not merely lines on a map. It was soldiers who gave loyalty, cities that yielded wealth, and people who followed strong voices. To divide such things neatly was nearly impossible. Constantine, as he grew into manhood, entered this world of uneasy cooperation, where alliances could shift overnight and trust was a rare commodity. The empire's leaders at this time were men hardened by war. Diocletian, ruling in the East, was a figure of order and ceremony, convinced that discipline and ritual could bind together a fractured realm. His co-Augustus in the West was Maximian, a soldier of rougher manner, less refined but equally determined to hold power. Beneath them were the Caesars, Galerius in the East, fierce and ambitious, and Constantius, Constantine's father, ruling in the West with a mixture of skill and restraint. For Constantine, the Tetrarchy meant both opportunity and danger. His father's place among the rulers gave him status, yet he himself was not formally recognized within the system. He was the son of a Caesar, but not yet heir to the purple. His future was uncertain, dependent on decisions made in distant courts and on the shifting fortunes of armies across the empire. Life under the Tetrarchy was marked by constant movement. Armies marched along the Rhine, guarding against Germanic raids. Others crossed into the deserts of Syria, watching the Persians. In Africa, grain was shipped north to feed the cities. In Italy, marble temples still shone in the sun, yet beneath their glitter the people muttered about taxes and wars. Every part of the empire carried weight, and every ruler sought to prove his worth by victory. Constantine served within this structure, moving between courts and campaigns. He rode with armies, he studied the strategies of generals, and he learned how fragile loyalty could be. Soldiers might swear allegiance to one Augustus one year and to his rival the next. Cities opened their gates to one claimant, then betrayed him when another approached. The empire was restless, its unity always under strain. In this atmosphere, Constantine learned caution. He watched Diocletian's court, where ceremonies became ever more elaborate, where the emperor appeared robed in purple and gold, surrounded by guards rarely seen by ordinary men. The emperor was to be revered almost as a god, distant and exalted. To approach him was to follow strict ritual, eyes lowered, words carefully measured. Power was clothed in mystery. Constantine observed all of this, storing it away for the day when he himself would command. But he also saw another side, the ambition of Galerius, the ferocity of Maximian, the determination of his own father. These were men of action, who commanded loyalty not only by ritual, but by strength in battle. Among soldiers, respect was not earned by golden robes, but by sharing hardship, marching through mud, standing firm in rain, charging into the clash of swords. Constantine understood both worlds, the glitter of the court and the grit of the camp. He knew that to survive, a ruler must hold both the loyalty of armies and the authority of the throne. The Tetrarchy worked for a time. Victories were won on the frontiers. Taxes were collected more efficiently. Order seemed restored. But beneath the surface, cracks grew. When Diocletian retired in 305, the careful balance began to unravel. New rulers were appointed, but not all were satisfied with the choices. Ambition stirred in the hearts of those left aside. The empire, once more, edged toward conflict. For Constantine, this was a turning point. He had been serving in the east under Galerius, but when news came that his father Constantius was ill in Britain, he sought permission to join him. Galerius hesitated, fearing to lose so capable a man, but Constantine moved quickly. Stories tell of him riding with desperate speed, cutting the legs of horses to prevent pursuers from catching him, changing mounts at each station until at last he reached the western frontier and the side of his father. When Constantius died in 306 at York, the army wasted no time. They raised Constantine on their shields, hailed him as Augustus, and proclaimed him emperor. It was not according to the plans of the Tetrarchy, but it was according to the will of soldiers, and in Rome, as often before, that was enough. The proclamation set off a chain reaction. Other rulers protested, arguing over titles and legitimacy. Galerius recognized Constantine only as Caesar, not Augustus. Maxentius, son of Maximian, seized power in Rome itself. Licinius, another general, rose in the east. Alliances formed and broke, armies marched, and civil wars flared. The careful balance of Diocletian's tetrarchy dissolved into the old familiar chaos, the struggle of rival emperors for control of the whole. For Constantine, this was both challenge and opportunity. He had soldiers who trusted him. He had the loyalty of provinces in Gaul and Britain, but he did not yet have the recognition of all the empire. He would need to prove himself in battle, to defeat rivals one by one, and to show that he alone was strong enough to rule. Through the years that followed, Constantine maneuvered carefully. He struck alliances when useful, broke them when necessary, and always kept his armies close. He defeated one rival in the field, then turned against another. Slowly, step by step, he rose higher, until at last the great confrontation loomed. The struggle against Maxentius, who held Rome itself. That clash at the Milvian bridge would decide not only the fate of Constantine, but the fate of the faith that was spreading quietly across the empire. But before we reach that vision, before we hear of the cross in the sky, we must pause and understand this. Constantine's rise was not sudden, not miraculous in a single moment. It was shaped by years of learning, of serving, of watching power at close hand. He grew up in the Tetrarchy, saw its strengths, and knew its weaknesses. He lived through intrigue, through rivalry, through the endless shifting of alliances. He learned that the empire was too vast, too restless to be governed by fragile agreements alone. It would take strength and more than strength to hold it together. The world of 4 rulers could not last. The world of 1 ruler was waiting, and Constantine was ready to step into it. When Constantine was proclaimed Augustus by the soldiers at York in 306, it was not the end of the story. In truth, it was only the beginning. To be hailed by an army was powerful, but it was not the same as being recognized across the empire. Other rulers stood ready to contest his claim. Maxentius in Rome, Galerius in the east, Licinius rising as another player. Each believed himself rightful. Each was unwilling to yield. The stage was set for years of struggle, for rivalries that would shape the fate of millions. Constantine began by securing his position in Gaul and Britain. These provinces, hardened by frontier life, gave him strong legions and loyal soldiers. They had known Constantius, his father, and so they trusted his son. Taxes flowed into his coffers, grain filled his storehouses, and iron for weapons was drawn from the mines of the west. His armies marched with discipline, their standards held high, their loyalty to Constantine clear. But across the empire, confusion reigned. The Tetrarchy had collapsed into rivalry. Galerius, still powerful in the east, sneered at Constantine's claim and granted him only the title of Caesar. Maxentius seized Rome itself, proclaiming himself emperor there with the support of the Praetorian Guard. Maximian, his father and a former Augustus, returned from retirement to lend his name to the cause. Licinius rose with his own armies, seeking a share of power. The empire was once more divided, its unity broken, its future uncertain. For Constantine, the next years were filled with careful calculation. He struck alliances where useful, sometimes with Licinius, sometimes with others, always watching, always weighing the balance of power. He fought campaigns along the Rhine, defeating Germanic tribes and securing his borders. Each victory strengthened his claim, for the loyalty of soldiers came not only from titles, but from triumph in battle. When Constantine led, he led from the front, sharing in the hardships of marches, eating the same bread, drinking the same water. His men loved him for it, and their devotion would carry him through the years to come. Meanwhile in Rome, Maxentius ruled uneasily. At first he was welcomed, for he promised to restore the city's dignity and to favor the Senate. But over time, discontent grew. Taxes were heavy, grain was short, and the Praetorian Guard held too much influence. Whispers spread that he was cruel, that he sought his own glory above the good of the people. Constantine, watching from afar, knew that one day he would have to march against Maxentius, for no empire could endure 2 masters. The years passed, and the rivalry deepened. Battles flared across provinces, armies moved like pieces on a vast board. Constantine proved himself again and again, defeating Franks on the Rhine, securing cities in Gaul, and pressing steadily southward. Each step brought him closer to Rome, closer to the confrontation that all knew must come. At the same time, Constantine began to show a new side of his rule. He was not only a soldier, but also a statesman. He issued coins that bore his image with symbols of victory and hope. He spoke of stability, of renewal, of an empire restored. He treated Christians with unusual favor, allowing them to worship freely in his domains, while in other parts of the empire persecution still lingered. Slowly he began to gather not only armies, but also the prayers of a growing faith. By the year 312, the march toward destiny was clear. Constantine gathered his forces and prepared to strike south toward Rome itself. His army was not the largest the empire had ever seen, but it was disciplined, loyal, and hardened by years of campaign. Standards glittered in the sun, shields shone with fresh polish, cavalry horses snorted and stamped as trumpets called. The soldiers knew what lay ahead. To march on Rome was to challenge Maxentius directly, to fight for the very heart of the empire. The journey south was long but steady. Constantine moved with caution, ensuring his supply lines, securing towns along the way, winning small battles that weakened his enemy's strength. Villages watched as the columns passed. The tramp of boots on the road, the creak of wagons, the glint of spears stretching into the distance. Farmers paused in their fields, children clutched their mothers' hands, and elders whispered, "This is the man who marches to Rome." At each stop, Constantine strengthened his position. He took care not to plunder needlessly, for he sought to present himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. His soldiers were ordered to discipline, to pay for food where possible, to respect the local people. In return, he gained support, for many were weary of Maxentius and his heavy hand. The march became not only a military advance, but a gathering of momentum as cities opened their gates and allies pledged their loyalty. As Constantine drew closer to Rome, tension grew. Maxentius could not ignore the threat. He called forth his armies, gathering the Praetorian Guard, summoning legions from Italy and beyond. The city itself prepared for war, its walls strengthened, its gates secured. Inside Rome, fear mingled with defiance. Some prayed for victory, others whispered of betrayal, but all knew that a great battle was near. Constantine himself was calm. He had faced many enemies before, but this was different. This was Rome, the eternal city, the seat of empire. To march against it was to march against centuries of tradition, to stake everything on one confrontation. Yet he did not hesitate. He had come too far, fought too many battles, and carried too great a destiny to turn back now. The stage was set. The year was 312. Constantine's army camped north of the city near the Tiber River. Maxentius held Rome, its gates closed, its people restless. Between them lay the Milvian Bridge, a crossing that would decide the fate of the empire. And on the eve of that battle, something happened. Something that would change not only the life of Constantine, but the life of the empire itself. The night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is remembered as the moment when Constantine's destiny shifted forever. Historians across centuries have told the story in different ways, with different details, but the heart of it remains the same, that on the eve of battle, Constantine saw a vision, a sign in the heavens that would mark not only his victory, but the future of the empire. Let us step into that evening. The year was 312. Constantine's army had marched south, through towns and fields, gathering strength as it came. Now it camped on the northern edge of Rome, near the Tiber River. The air was heavy with expectation. Fires burned across the fields, their smoke curling upward into the dusk. Soldiers mended their weapons, sharpened swords, checked armor. Horses were tethered and fed, their breath steaming in the cool night air. Tents stood in rows, their canvas rustling softly as the wind moved across the plain. Inside those tents, the soldiers spoke in low voices. Some boasted of victory to come, others prayed quietly to their gods. Many had fought long years with Constantine, on the Rhine, in Gaul, against Germans and Franks. They trusted him, but they knew Maxentius commanded strong forces within Rome, and the Praetorian Guard was fierce and proud. Tomorrow would not be an easy day. Tomorrow would decide who ruled the empire. Constantine himself stood apart, thoughtful. He had marched far, defeated rivals, built loyalty among his men. And yet this battle was different. It was not only a clash of armies, but a clash for Rome itself, the eternal city. If he lost, all would be undone. If he won, he would stand as master of the West. The weight of empire pressed upon him. And then, as the story is told, he lifted his eyes to the sky. Some say it was in the afternoon with the sun still shining. Others say it was in the quiet of the night when the stars glittered above. But what he saw was unlike anything he had seen before. Above the horizon, in the heavens themselves, appeared a sign, a cross of light, shining brighter than the sun, stretching across the sky. Alongside it were words written in Greek. In this sign, conquer. The soldiers around him looked upward, astonished. Some shielded their eyes, others fell to their knees. The light lingered, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Constantine gazed at it, his mind racing. He was not yet baptized, not yet a Christian in the full sense, but he knew the symbol. He had seen it on the banners of Christians, heard it spoken of in their prayers. To see it now, at this moment, seemed no accident. That night, as sleep came to the camp, Constantine dreamed. Christ himself, so the story says, appeared to him, bearing the same sign, the cross of light. He instructed Constantine to mark this symbol upon the shields of his soldiers, to carry it into battle as a standard of victory. When morning came, Constantine gave the order. The soldiers took their shields, polished from long use, and painted upon them the Chi Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, intertwined like a cross. To some it seemed strange, for they had long carried eagles or laurel wreaths, symbols of Rome's power. But Constantine commanded it, and they obeyed. The new sign gleamed in the light of dawn, fresh paint shining on rows of shields. The camp stirred with new energy. Some whispered in awe, believing a divine power now walked with them. Others, uncertain, muttered quietly, wondering what it meant. But all felt the weight of the moment. Something had changed. The march to battle was no longer only the clash of men, but a struggle marked by heaven itself. This vision, told and retold, became one of the most famous moments in history. Writers of the time gave different versions. Lactantius, a Christian advisor at Constantine's court, spoke of the dream, of Christ commanding the new symbol. Eusebius, writing later, told of the shining cross in the sky, witnessed by Constantine and his army alike. Skeptics doubted, wondering if it was a trick of the light, a story shaped after victory, a tale told to give divine meaning to earthly triumph. But for Constantine, and for those who followed him, the vision was real, and its meaning was clear. Let us pause here and imagine the weight of such a sign. An emperor on the eve of battle gazes to the heavens and sees the symbol of a faith long persecuted. He dreams of Christ, not as a distant figure, but as one who speaks directly, giving command. And in the morning, his army, thousands of men strong, march beneath a new banner, a banner not of eagles or old gods, but of the cross. For the Christians who heard this story, it was nothing less than miraculous. The God they worshipped in secret, the Lord they remembered in catacombs and courtyards, had revealed himself to the emperor. The persecuted faith was no longer hidden. It had risen into the sky itself, seen by soldiers, marked on shields, carried into the heart of battle. For the soldiers, the vision gave courage. They marched with the belief that heaven was on their side, that victory was promised not only by their leader, but by the God who had shown his sign. The clash to come would be fierce, but they bore a new confidence, their shields gleaming with a symbol that spoke of light, of promise, of destiny. And for Constantine, the vision marked a turning. He had always been ambitious, always sought power, but now he carried something greater. He believed himself chosen, favored, guided by a divine hand. Tomorrow's battle would not only decide the empire, it would seal a covenant between emperor and God. As night deepened, the camp grew quiet. Fires burned low, soldiers slept on the ground, swords within reach, shields close by. Above them, the stars stretched across the heavens, silent and vast. And among those stars, in the mind of Constantine, lingered the memory of the cross of light, shining as a promise, a command, a destiny. The morning would bring the clash of armies, the roar of trumpets, the thunder of hooves. But tonight, in the stillness before battle, a vision had been given, and that vision would change everything. The morning of October the 28th, 312, rose cool and bright over the Tiber River. Mist clung to the low fields, drifting slowly above the grass. Beyond the river, the towers of Rome could be glimpsed in the distance, their outlines softened by the haze of dawn. Between the city and the camp of Constantine lay the Milvian Bridge, a stone crossing that had stood for centuries. Today it would become the stage for one of history's great battles, a struggle that would decide who ruled the empire, and a turning point for the faith that had once been hunted in shadows. Constantine rose early. He had not forgotten the vision of the cross. His soldiers had painted the Chi-Rho upon their shields, the intertwined letters of Christ gleaming fresh in the morning light. Standards bearing the same mark were raised above the camp, fluttering in the breeze. Trumpets sounded, deep and steady, their notes carrying across the plain. Men gathered in ranks, armor clattering, horses stamping impatiently as their riders checked saddles and spears. The air was tense with expectation. Soldiers whispered prayers, some to the old gods, some now to the God of the Christians whose sign they bore. Others said nothing at all, staring ahead with grim determination. They knew what was at stake. If they lost, exile or death awaited. If they won, glory, plunder, and a share in their leader's triumph. Across the river, Maxentius held his forces. His men lined the walls of Rome. His banners flew above the gates. His Praetorian guard stood ready, proud and fierce. Maxentius himself remained within the city until the last moment, relying on its defenses, confident in the loyalty of his soldiers and in the strength of numbers. Yet the people of Rome were restless. Some feared Constantine, others longed for him, weary of Maxentius's heavy hand. Behind those walls, tension burned as brightly as on the battlefield. By mid-morning the armies faced one another. The plain north of Rome echoed with the sound of marching feet, of standards snapping in the wind, of horses neighing as lines formed. Constantine rode among his men, calm and resolute. He spoke not with long speeches, but with presence, his very nearness steadying their hearts. They looked upon him and saw a leader who shared their dangers, who bore the same dust and hunger, who had marched beside them through years of campaign. And then the order was given. Trumpets blared, shields lifted, spears leveled. The lines began to move. Step by step, the armies advanced toward one another, the ground trembling beneath their weight. The clash was sudden and fierce. Arrows darkened the sky, raining down upon shields. Spears splintered, swords flashed, shields struck shields with the sound of thunder. The air was filled with shouts. Orders barked by officers, cries of pain, the steady chant of soldiers pressing forward. Horses charged, their hooves pounding, their riders leaning low with lances aimed. Dust rose in clouds, mingling with the smoke of burning pitch hurled from engines. Constantine's men fought with determination. They believed themselves favored by heaven, marked by the sign of the cross. Wherever their line wavered, Constantine himself was seen, riding swiftly, raising his hand, urging them on. His presence moved like fire through the ranks, kindling courage, steadying fear. He was not a distant commander, but a leader among them, sharing their fate. Maxentius's forces fought with equal fury. The Praetorian Guard, proud defenders of Rome, stood firm against the advance. Their armor shone, their standards bore the emblems of old tradition. Their discipline was hard. Yet for all their strength, they faced an army whose spirit could not be broken. The lines surged back and forth, shields grinding, swords clashing, dust and sweat covering men until they were scarcely recognizable. At last, the tide began to turn. Constantine's cavalry struck with force, breaking through weakened lines. Infantry pressed forward step by step, their shields locked, their spears thrusting. Maxentius's men faltered, then began to give way. What had begun as steady resistance crumbled into retreat. Shouts of triumph rose from Constantine's ranks, echoing across the river. Maxentius himself, seeing the day slipping from him, fled toward the Milvian bridge. His soldiers followed in panic, crowding the narrow crossing, pressing upon one another in desperate haste. Some stumbled, falling into the river below. Others pushed forward, only to be struck down by pursuers at their heels. The bridge, once steady stone, became chaos, filled with men, weapons, fear, and death. In the press of bodies, Maxentius was swept into the river. Weighted by armor, he struggled, but the current pulled him down. The waters closed over him, and the man who had claimed Rome was gone, swallowed by the Tiber. His body, later recovered, would be carried through the streets, not in triumph, but in defeat. On the far bank, Constantine's army stood victorious. The field was theirs. The standards of the cross rose high, gleaming in the sunlight, banners of victory not only in war, but in faith. Soldiers raised their voices, shouting in triumph, some weeping with joy, others sinking to their knees in thanks. The vision of the night before had become reality. The sign of Christ had led them, and victory was theirs. As the dust settled, the plain was silent, but for the groans of the wounded and the cries of crows circling above. Broken shields lay scattered, spears snapped, helmets dented. The Tiber carried away the bodies of the fallen, its waters darkened with the traces of battle. Yet amid the ruin stood Constantine, calm and steady, his eyes turned toward Rome. The gates of the city opened, not with defiance, but with welcome. The people, weary of Maxentius, greeted Constantine as a liberator. Flowers were strewn upon the streets, songs rose from the crowds, voices cried his name. He entered not as a conqueror who destroyed, but as a ruler who restored. The Senate hailed him. The people blessed him. The city itself seemed to breathe again after years of unease. This was more than a victory of armies. It was a victory of symbols, of destiny, of faith. For the first time, the empire had been won not beneath the eagle alone, but beneath the cross. The god once worshipped in secret had shown his power upon the battlefield, and the emperor himself had been the instrument of that power. For Constantine, the meaning was clear. He was chosen, favored, guided by heaven. His path was no longer only that of a soldier or a politician. It was the path of one marked by divine purpose. From this day, his reign would be shaped by that vision, by that sign, by that victory. The Milvian bridge was not merely a crossing of stone. It was the threshold between old and new, between the empire of many gods and the empire that would soon bow to one. And as Constantine rode through the gates of Rome, cheered by the people, crowned with laurel, bearing the memory of the cross in the sky, he carried with him not only the empire, but the dawn of a new age. The victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312 had given Constantine the West. Rome had hailed him as emperor, the people cheered him as a liberator, and the Senate welcomed him as the master of the city. But victory alone could not heal an empire. Years of division, rivalry, and persecution had left wounds deep and raw. If Constantine was to rule not only by the sword, but by stability, he needed more than triumph in battle. He needed peace, not only for the empire itself, but for its people, and for the growing faith that had followed him to victory beneath the sign of the cross. And so, in the year 313, Constantine met with Licinius, his ally and brother-in-law, in the northern Italian city of Milan. The occasion was at first a wedding. Licinius was to marry Constantine's half-sister Constantia. But the gathering became something far more significant. For there, in private meetings and public proclamations, an agreement was reached that would reshape the place of Christianity forever. It became known as the Edict of Milan. Before this moment, the Church had lived always in tension. At times tolerated, at times persecuted, it had never known security. Believers gathered in homes or catacombs, never certain when soldiers might burst in, when their scrolls might be burned, when their leaders might be dragged before courts. Some emperors had been indifferent, others hostile, but none had ever granted lasting protection. The scars of the great persecution under Diocletian and Galerius were still fresh, churches demolished, scriptures destroyed, martyrs remembered with tears and pride. The Edict of Milan changed all of this. In calm and deliberate words, Constantine and Licinius proclaimed that Christians were to be granted the freedom to worship openly, without fear. Their property, once confiscated, was to be restored. Their gatherings, once banned, were now permitted. No man or woman was to be forced to sacrifice against conscience. The empire, for the first time, stretched out a hand not to strike the church, but to shield it. Imagine what this meant to those who heard it. For generations, Christians had whispered prayers in hidden places, knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment or death. Now, suddenly, the empire itself declared, "You may worship freely." Churches once pulled down were rebuilt in stone. Scriptures once smuggled in secret were copied openly. Bishops once hiding in exile returned to their flocks. Where fear had once hung like a shadow, joy now rang like a bell. The edict did not speak only of Christianity. It granted freedom of worship more broadly, declaring that each person might honor the god or gods they chose, in hopes that all divine powers would grant favor to the empire. But all knew that the true beneficiaries were the Christians, who for the first time stood not at the edge of society, but within its law, protected by decree of emperors themselves. Picture a Christian family in those days. Only a few years earlier, they might have crept at night to a neighbor's house, closing doors, whispering hymns, hiding their scrolls. Now, with the edict proclaimed, they gathered openly. A bishop preached in the sunlight. A crowd sang psalms without fear. A new church began to rise, its stones laid with confidence that it would not be torn down. For them, it must have felt as if the world had shifted on its axis, as if the heavens themselves had opened. For Constantine, the edict was both personal and political. He had marched to battle beneath the sign of the cross. He had seen victory where others expected defeat. To honor the God who had given him triumph seemed natural. But he also understood the wisdom of peace. By protecting Christians, he bound their loyalty to him. By proclaiming freedom, he gained the trust of those weary of persecution's cruelty. And by placing himself as the patron of harmony, he stood not only as a conqueror, but as a giver of peace. The Edict of Milan spread slowly across the empire. Messengers carried copies to distant provinces, their horses clattering along stone roads, their parchments sealed with imperial marks. In cities of the east, Licinius proclaimed it. In towns of the west, Constantine's officials read it aloud. Everywhere it was heard, it stirred amazement. In Antioch, Christians wept as they heard the words. In Carthage, bishops gave thanks. In Alexandria, crowds gathered in the streets to sing. The faith that had once seemed fragile now stood secure, its roots sunk deep in every province, its branches stretching wide across the empire. Yet the edict was more than words on parchment. It was a symbol, a turning of the tide. The empire that had once hurled its power against Christians now offered them protection. The rulers who had once demanded sacrifices to the old gods now gave back churches to the followers of Christ. A door had opened, and through it Christianity stepped into a new world. A world not of hiding, but of honor. Not of fear, but of favor. Of course, not all welcomed the change. Devotees of the old gods grumbled that their temples were being neglected, that the empire's favor was shifting too far toward this new faith. Priests of Jupiter, of Mars, of Apollo looked with suspicion upon Constantine's choices. Yet the emperor was steady. He did not forbid the old gods, but he gave his strength to the new. Slowly, gently, without decree of destruction, he turned the empire toward Christianity. Think of what this meant for the long memory of the Church. For 3 centuries, believers had told stories of martyrs, of trials, of steadfastness under persecution. Parents had warned their children that to follow Christ was to risk everything. Now, in a single year, all of that was changed. The danger had passed. The Church was free, and the emperor himself was its protector. The Edict of Milan was not merely a law. It was a beginning. It marked the dawn of a new chapter. The chapter of Christianity not as a hidden sect, but as a public faith. Not as an outlawed minority, but as a partner of empire. It would bring blessings and it would bring challenges. For to be free is one thing, but to be favored by rulers is another. Yet, in that moment, in 313, the joy was simple and profound. The long night of persecution was over. The morning had come. The Edict of Milan in 313 was more than a piece of parchment. It was the door through which Christianity stepped into a new life within the empire. For centuries the Church had lived in shadows, gathering in homes and catacombs, whispering prayers, fearing sudden arrest. Now, suddenly the empire itself had declared its protection. But Constantine went further still. He did not merely allow the Church to exist. He became its patron, its protector, its friend. Let us imagine the change this brought. A bishop in Gaul, who once preached in a half-ruined house, now received letters from the emperor himself, restoring property, granting funds, even inviting him to court. A congregation in Africa, whose meeting place had been torn down during the Great Persecution, now found the land returned to them with imperial support to build anew. In Rome itself, Where martyrs had once died in arenas, Christians now walked openly through the streets, their heads high, their gatherings unbroken, their songs rising into the air without fear. Constantine did not treat this as a distant matter. He involved himself directly. He ordered that confiscated properties be returned to the church, even if they had been sold to others. Compensation was paid out of the imperial treasury. He gave gifts of gold and silver, funded the building of churches, and exempted clergy from certain civic duties so that they might devote themselves fully to worship and service. In letters that still survive, he spoke of the church with reverence, calling its leaders men of God and urging governors to show them favor. This was something new. Never before had the church enjoyed not only freedom but active support. And it was not only wealth or buildings that Constantine gave, he gave prestige. Bishops were invited to court, treated with honor, listened to in matters of dispute. When quarrels broke out within the church, Constantine sometimes stepped in, urging unity, calling councils, and reminding believers that division weakened their witness. He saw himself not as a theologian, but as a guardian of peace. If Christ had given him victory, then it was his duty to protect Christ's people. For the Christians of the empire, this must have felt almost unbelievable. Only a few years earlier, they had watched churches burn, seen scriptures tossed into flames, mourned martyrs taken from them. Now, those same churches were being rebuilt at imperial expense. New basilicas rose, not in secret, but in the heart of cities, their doors wide, their altars bright with candles. Instead of hiding scrolls, bishops now copied them freely, their words carried across provinces in neat, careful script. The faith that had once survived by endurance now flourished by favor. But Constantine's patronage was not only practical, it was symbolic. By aligning himself with the church, he showed the empire that Christianity was not a fringe sect, not a superstition, not a threat, but a faith worthy of respect. Coins were minted with signs of the new favor. Standards were carried with the symbol of the Chi Rho. The emperor who once might have bowed before Jupiter now raised his eyes to Christ. To his subjects, the message was clear. If the emperor himself honored this faith, who could call it dishonorable? Of course, not all were pleased. Priests of the old gods looked on with suspicion. Temples, once crowded, now grew quieter. State funds, once given to ancient cults, were diverted to the church. Some whispered that Constantine had betrayed Rome's traditions, that the gods would punish such neglect. Yet the emperor did not destroy the old ways outright. Temples were not torn down, sacrifices were not forbidden. Instead, Constantine moved carefully, step by step, giving more weight to the church while letting the old religions fade in their own time. Among Christians themselves, reactions were mixed. Many rejoiced, seeing Constantine as chosen by God, the protector sent after centuries of trial. Others were cautious, wondering if closeness to power might corrupt the simplicity of the faith. Could the church remain holy when embraced by emperors? Could bishops speak freely if they depended on imperial favor? These questions would echo for centuries. But in the moment, the relief was overwhelming. For the first time in memory, Christians could live openly, pray openly, build openly, and they did so with joy. Constantine himself seemed sincere in his devotion. He attended Christian worship, though not yet baptized. He spoke of Christ with respect and of the cross as his sign of victory. He gave land to the church, built basilicas, and wrote to bishops as allies. Yet he also remained cautious, never fully breaking with the old traditions, never forcing conversion. His was not the zeal of a missionary, but the careful hand of a ruler, guiding the empire gently toward a new center. Imagine the daily life of a Christian in these years. Where once they feared soldiers at the door, now they heard news of imperial letters favoring their church. Where once they crept through back alleys, now they processed openly, singing hymns as they carried candles into new basilicas. Children who had grown up hearing stories of martyrdom now saw their bishops honored by the emperor himself. The shift must have felt almost like living in a new world. The emperor's patronage also changed the appearance of cities. Basilicas rose with tall roofs and wide halls, built to hold the growing congregations. Their walls were adorned with frescoes, their floors with mosaics, their altars with lamps burning day and night. These were not hidden places of worship, but monumental buildings visible to all, standing beside temples of marble and columns of stone. They declared by their very presence that the faith of Christ was no longer in shadow, but in the light. In Rome, in Jerusalem, in Antioch, in Constantinople, Constantine's generosity reshaped the landscape. Churches were built where once Christians had died. Basilicas rose where once houses had held small gatherings. Pilgrims began to travel, not in fear, but in joy, visiting holy places supported by the emperor's gifts. From patron to protector, this was Constantine's role. He did not merely free the church, he lifted it, supported it, honored it. He gave it resources, prestige, and protection. In doing so, he forever changed its place in the empire. No longer a persecuted sect, no longer a fragile minority, the church now stood at the heart of power, its voice heard in the halls of emperors, its altars shining in the centers of cities. It was a change both wondrous and weighty, for with honor came responsibility, with favor came temptation, with protection came compromise. But in those early years, the joy was simple. The church had found a friend in the throne, a protector in the emperor, a patron in Constantine. With the Edict of Milan proclaimed and the church lifted into favor, Constantine's patronage soon took visible form. He was not content to grant freedom in words alone. He gave stone, marble, timber, and labor. He built. And through his building, the empire itself was reshaped. Where once temples to Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo had dominated the skyline, now vast Christian basilicas began to rise. Their walls, their arches, their wide halls declared in stone what Constantine had already proclaimed in law, that Christianity had stepped from the shadows into the heart of public life. Let us walk slowly into this world of building. Imagine the city of Rome, ancient and crowded, its streets winding between temples, forums, and baths. For centuries, the temples had been the pride of Rome. The great Capitoline Hill was crowned with the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Columns gleamed in the sun. Statues of the gods lined the squares. Incense drifted in the air during festivals. But now, something new appeared. On the Vatican Hill, across the river from the city, Constantine ordered the construction of a great church, one dedicated to the Apostle Peter, who had been martyred in Rome centuries earlier. This was Old St. Peter's Basilica. Its scale was immense. A wide nave stretched long and high, its roof supported by rows of columns. At its far end stood the altar, over the very place where Peter was believed to be buried. Pilgrims could enter, walking beneath the tall arches, seeing light filter down through high windows, hearing the echo of psalms rise into the air. Where once a quiet grave had marked the apostles' resting place, now a vast basilica honored him, built by the emperor himself. But this was not the only basilica. Constantine also built the Lateran Basilica, which he gave as the bishop's cathedral in Rome. It was to become the seat of the Bishop of Rome, who would later be known as the Pope. Here too the halls were vast, able to hold thousands. Its walls were adorned with paintings, its floors laid with mosaics. Lamps burned, filling the air with steady light. It was not a hidden chapel, but a public monument, as grand as any temple the empire had ever known. Beyond Rome, Constantine's buildings stretched farther still. In Jerusalem, he commissioned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over the site where Christ was believed to have been buried and to have risen from the dead. Helena, his mother, travelled there, seeking holy places, and returned with relics and memories of the land where Christ had walked. The basilica she helped inspire became a centre for pilgrims who came from across the empire to pray where Christ had been laid. In Constantinople, the new city Constantine was founding in the east, churches rose alongside palaces and forums. In Antioch, in Nicomedia, in Trier, basilicas began to appear, funded by imperial wealth, designed with imperial vision. No longer did Christians gather in small homes or repurposed halls. They worshipped in spaces that rivaled the grandeur of Rome itself. Let us pause here and imagine the effect. A Christian family who once crept quietly to a neighbour's courtyard for worship now entered a basilica with tall walls, columns reaching high above, lamps glowing in the dusk, psalms echoing from stone. For the first time, their faith felt not only permitted, but celebrated. They belonged not at the margins, but at the centre. The emperor himself had raised these walls, laid these foundations, and placed the cross where once altars to the old gods had stood. The basilicas themselves carried a distinctive style. They were not designed as temples, for Christianity had no need of inner sanctums closed to the people. Instead, they were long halls, open and wide, where the faithful could gather as one body. The nave stretched before them. The altar stood visible. The bishop's chair rose at the far end. Light streamed from windows high above, filling the space not with darkness, but with clarity. The architecture itself spoke of openness, of community, of worship, shared together. These buildings were not only for worship, they became centres of community. Within their walls, the poor were fed, the sick were cared for, the scriptures were read and copied. They were places of baptism, of marriage, of burial, of memory. In a world where life was uncertain and short, the basilica stood as a steady presence, its stones enduring, its lamps burning, its prayers rising, and always, above them, the emperor's hand was visible. Constantine had given the land, the funds, the permission. His name was remembered in inscriptions, his image sometimes carved into stone. For the Christians, this was more than generosity. It was a sign of divine favour. The ruler of the empire, who once might have ordered their deaths, now gave them basilicas. To walk into those halls was to see the fulfilment of hope, the turning of history. Yet even here, questions lingered. Some wondered if the closeness of emperor and church was too close. Could the church remain pure when so tied to power? Could bishops remain free when they owed their buildings to imperial gift? But in the moment, joy overshadowed doubt. After centuries of hiding, to worship openly in halls of light felt like a miracle. Constantine's basilicas reshaped the very image of cities. Travellers entering Rome no longer saw only temples to Jupiter and Mars. They saw basilicas to Peter and to Christ. Pilgrims in Jerusalem no longer found only ruins and memory. They entered a basilica that honoured the resurrection itself. The skyline of the empire had changed. Its stones now bore witness to a new faith, rising not only in hearts, but in marble and wood. And so, through his building, Constantine declared in stone what he had already declared in law. Christianity was no longer a faith of shadows. It was a faith of light, of space, of community, of permanence. Basilicas rose where temples once stood. Crosses shone where idols once loomed. The empire itself was being rebuilt, one stone at a time, one basilica at a time, one act of patronage at a time. This was Constantine the builder, not only of armies, not only of victories, but of basilicas. and through those basilicas the faith of Christ took root in the very heart of the empire. The Basilicas of Constantine rose across the empire, vast and shining, places where Christians gathered in joy and in peace. But while the buildings stood strong in stone, the church itself was less steady in spirit. For though persecution had ended, another struggle was rising, a struggle not of swords, but of words, not of emperors, but of bishops, not of armies, but of theology. It was the question of who Christ truly was, and it threatened to divide the church just as surely as wars had divided the empire. For centuries, Christians had confessed Christ as Lord, worshipped him in prayer, and remembered him in bread and wine. But the mystery of his nature had never been pressed into precise definition. Was he truly equal with the Father, or in some way lesser? Was he eternal or created? Was he of the same essence as God, or merely like him? These questions, once spoken only in sermons and letters, now spread widely as the church grew, and in the early 4th century they burst into controversy with a force that shook the Christian world. At the center stood a priest from Alexandria, a man named Arius. He was tall, austere, respected for his learning and his discipline, and he taught that the Son was not eternal but created, exalted above all creation, yes, but not equal with the Father. There was a time, he said, when the Son was not. To many this seemed logical. How could the Son be begotten and yet eternal? How could he be truly divine if he came after the Father? Arius spoke clearly, persuasively, and soon many followed him, but others resisted fiercely. Chief among them was Athanasius, a young deacon also from Alexandria. For him, Arius's teaching was a deadly error. If Christ were not fully God, then salvation itself was at risk. Only God could save humanity, and if Christ were less than God, his cross and resurrection could not redeem the world. For Athanasius and many like him, the Son was eternal, uncreated, of the same essence as the Father, true God from true God. The dispute spread like fire. Bishops took sides, sermons echoed with debate, congregations quarreled, letters flew across provinces. In Antioch, in Alexandria, in Nicomedia, in Rome, the argument raged. Ordinary Christians heard the controversy in the streets, in markets, in baths, even in taverns. It was said that in Constantinople, bakers and dock workers could be heard debating the nature of the Son as they kneaded dough or loaded ships. The Church, once united in suffering under persecution, now risked tearing itself apart in freedom. Constantine, watching this unfold, was alarmed. He had given the Church peace, he had built its basilicas, he had raised its prestige, and now it seemed ready to split itself in two over a matter of doctrine. For Constantine, unity was everything. An empire divided by rival emperors had nearly collapsed. Now he feared a church divided by rival bishops would weaken both faith and empire alike. He was not a theologian, but he was a ruler, and he understood that division left unchecked could spread like cracks in stone. At first, he tried letters. He wrote to bishops, urging them to set aside quarrels, to find harmony, to remember that peace was more important than words. He reminded them that Christ called for unity, not division. But the letters were not enough. The dispute only deepened, the arguments only sharpened, the factions only grew stronger. Constantine realized that more was needed, and so he resolved upon something bold, something unprecedented. If the Church could not resolve the matter in scattered councils, then let it gather in one great council. If bishops argued in letters, then let them speak face to face. If theology divided the provinces, then let the empire itself host a meeting to unite them. Constantine would call the bishops of the Christian world together, and there, in one assembly, they would seek agreement. The place he chose was Nicaea, a city in Bithynia, near his own palace at Nicomedia. It was convenient to reach, with good roads and safe lodging, and its halls could host a gathering of many. Messengers were sent across the empire carrying imperial invitations sealed with Constantine's authority. Bishops from every province were summoned, from Spain and Gaul in the west, from Egypt and Syria in the east, from Italy, from North Africa, from the islands of the Mediterranean. For the first time in history, the leaders of the church were called together not in secret, not in hiding, but openly, with the emperor himself as their host. Imagine the journey. An aged bishop from Spain leaning on a staff, crossing mountains and seas to reach the council. A young deacon from Egypt, eyes bright, carrying letters of support from his people. Monks from Syria, robed in coarse garments, walking barefoot along dusty roads. Some bore the scars of persecution, hands twisted from torture, faces marked by old wounds, eyes blinded in dungeons. They had once been hunted by emperors. Now they were invited by one. By the summer of 325, the bishops had gathered at Nicaea. Accounts say there were around 300, though others give higher or lower numbers. They filled the halls with their robes, their scrolls, their voices. Some spoke Latin, others Greek, others languages of distant provinces, but all came with one purpose: to settle the question of Christ. Constantine himself arrived, not in armor, but in simple white robes, without jewels, without crown. He walked among the bishops with respect, greeting them, honoring them, listening to them. He did not come as a conqueror to command, but as a host to guide. The bishops, who only years before might have fled from soldiers, now saw the emperor as their ally, their protector, their brother in faith. The road to Nicaea had been long, filled with quarrels, letters, sermons, and strife. But at last, the church was gathered. At last, the emperor had called them together. At last, the question would be faced not in scattered corners, but in one great council. And so, the stage was set. The Basilicas had been built, the edict proclaimed, the faith favored. Now it would be defined. The road to Nicaea was complete. The council itself was about to begin. The summer of 325 dawned bright over the city of Nicaea, nestled beside the wide waters of a lake in Bithynia. Its streets bustled with travellers, its inns crowded with visitors, its halls prepared for an event never seen before. For here, summoned by the Emperor Constantine, the bishops of the Christian world gathered. They came not in secret as they once had in times of persecution, but openly, with imperial protection, with honor, with welcome. It was the first ecumenical council, the Council of Nicaea. Imagine the scene. Along the roads leading into the city came bishops from every corner of the empire. Some travelled with servants carrying scrolls and letters. Others arrived with nothing but a staff and a small bundle. Some were old, their faces lined by years of trial. Others were young, full of fire and energy. Some bore scars from persecution, twisted hands, blinded eyes, backs marked with lashings. These were men who had once stood in chains before governors, who had once been hunted by emperors. Now they came at the invitation of an emperor to debate not their survival but their faith. Accounts tell us that around 300 bishops were present, though the exact number is uncertain. They filled the hall with their presence, their robes of white, their voices in many tongues. Latin and Greek were most common, but others spoke in dialects from Syria, Egypt, even distant Gaul and Spain. It was a gathering not of one province, not of one city, but of the whole church. East and west, north and south, one body drawn together. Constantine himself entered the council with humility. He wore not the armor of a soldier, nor the crown of an emperor, but simple white robes, a symbol of reverence. He greeted the bishops with respect, honored them as men of God, and took his seat not upon a throne, but among them as one who listened. The bishops, who had once prayed in fear of emperors, now saw the emperor sitting quietly beside them, his presence a pledge of peace. The issue before them was urgent. The controversy stirred by Arius had spread far and wide. He and his followers taught that the Son was not eternal, but created, exalted, yes, but not equal to the Father. For Arius, there was a time when the Son was not. To others, this was intolerable, a denial of Christ's divinity, a threat to salvation itself. If Christ were not fully God, then how could he redeem humanity? If he were less than God, then the cross was emptied of its power. The bishops came to settle this question, to speak not only for themselves, but for the faith of generations to come. The debates were fierce. In the hall of Nicaea, voices rose and fell, arguments clashed like swords, tempers flared. Some bishops defended Arius, pointing to reason, to logic, to scripture interpreted in their way. Others opposed him passionately, declaring that the Son was eternal, uncreated, of the same essence as the Father. Athanasius, though only a young deacon, stood out among them, his words sharp, his conviction steady. He would not yield, for to him the truth was clear. Christ was God from true God, begotten, not made. Day after day the debates continued. Scrolls were unrolled, passages read aloud, interpretations argued. Some bishops sought compromise, others demanded clarity. Constantine himself listened patiently, urging unity, reminding them that division weakened the Church and the Empire alike. He was not a theologian, but he understood the weight of words, the need for agreement, the importance of peace. He urged them to find harmony, to settle the question, to speak with one voice. At last, the council reached its decision. With only a few dissenting, the bishops declared that the Son was indeed of the same essence as the Father. Homoousios, they said in Greek, one in being. Christ was not created, but eternal, not lesser, but equal. From this decision came the Nicene Creed, a confession of faith that echoed the council's voice. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, light of light, very God of very God, begotten not made, being of one substance with the Father. These words, spoken then, would echo through centuries, recited in churches from Antioch to Rome, from Africa to Gaul, from generation to generation. They became the anchor of orthodoxy, the shield against error, the song of unity. For Constantine, the council was a triumph. He had gathered the bishops, given them freedom, provided them with space and time, and guided them to agreement. For him, it was more than theology. It was the unity of the Church, the harmony of the empire, the peace of the people. What had been division was now concord, sealed not by the sword but by the word. When the council ended, the bishops departed, carrying with them copies of the creed, letters of instruction, memories of debate. They returned to their cities, to their basilicas, to their congregations, declaring what had been decided. Some rejoiced, others resisted, but all knew that something momentous had occurred. The Church had spoken as one. Let us pause and reflect on this moment. In less than a generation, the Church had moved from persecution to prominence, from catacombs to councils, from fear to freedom. The very men who once whispered hymns in secret now stood in the halls of empire, defining the faith for all to hear. And at the center of it stood Constantine, not a bishop, not a theologian, but the emperor who made it possible. The Council of Nicaea did not end all disputes. Arguments would continue, controversies would flare, factions would rise again. But the creed endured, steady as a rock amid waves, and the council itself became a model for the Church, that when division threatened, leaders could gather, pray, debate, and decide as one body. This was the Council of Nicaea, the first of its kind, the gathering that defined the faith, the meeting where bishops, scarred by persecution, sat under the protection of an emperor, and together declared that Christ was eternal, uncreated, true God of true God. And as Constantine looked upon their decision, he must have remembered the vision of the cross, the victory at the Milvian bridge, the Basilicas rising across the empire. All of it pointed to one truth, that the God who had given him victory was now shaping the empire itself, not only in stone, but in creed, in faith, in word. Constantine is remembered as a conqueror, as the builder of basilicas, as the patron of the Church, and as the emperor who saw the vision of the cross. But his reign was not only marked by battles and buildings. He was also a lawgiver, a ruler who reshaped the daily life of the empire through decrees and reforms. These laws touched not only soldiers and senators, but farmers, merchants, and families. They reached into homes and markets, into courts and churches, changing how people lived and how society understood itself. Let us step into this quieter but no less important side of his reign. Imagine a Roman town in the early 4th century, streets lined with stone houses, a market buzzing with traders, children playing with clay toys in dusty courtyards, elders sitting on shaded benches telling stories of wars long past. Life seemed ordinary, yet it was shaped at every turn by imperial law. Taxes demanded, punishments enforced, duties required. All flowed from decrees written in distant halls but felt in every village. Under Constantine, those decrees began to take a new shape, guided by both tradition and by the new faith rising at the heart of the empire. One of Constantine's most striking reforms concerned time itself. He decreed that the first day of the week, the day the Christians called the Lord's Day, should be a day of rest. Soldiers still guarded the empire, farmers still tended fields in emergencies, but for most the day was set apart. Markets closed, courts fell silent, workshops stood still. For the first time, the rhythm of the empire bowed, however slightly, to the rhythm of Christian worship. A day that had once been ordinary became holy, woven into the pattern of life for millions. Constantine also shaped laws concerning the family. Marriage, long treated as a practical arrangement, gained new protections. Adultery was punished more firmly, reflecting Christian moral teaching. Infanticide, once tragically common, was discouraged and in some cases banned outright. The exposure of infants, a practice long accepted in Rome, was restricted. Children who might once have been left to die on hillsides or at crossroads now found some measure of safety under new laws. Slavery, too, felt the touch of reform. Constantine did not abolish it. That would not come for many centuries, but he softened its harshness. Masters were restricted from certain cruelties. The Church was given the right to intervene in cases of abuse. Slaves could seek refuge in a church, and from there appeal for mercy. It was a small beginning, a faint light in a dark system, but it marked the influence of Christian compassion upon imperial law. The poor also gained protection. Constantine granted bishops the right to oversee the distribution of charity, ensuring that alms reached widows, orphans, and the needy. He provided funds from the treasury for those in famine-stricken regions. He reduced certain taxes for struggling communities. Where once the empire had cared little for the weak, now it began to bend, however imperfectly, toward mercy. Law touched even the sacred. Constantine ordered that churches be exempt from certain civic burdens. Clergy were freed from the demand to serve in public offices so that they might devote themselves fully to ministry. Lands given to churches were protected, their revenues supporting the work of faith. Disputes could be brought before bishops, whose judgments carried weight alongside imperial courts. For the first time, the church became not only a spiritual refuge but a legal one, a place where justice and mercy met. Yet Constantine was still a Roman emperor, and his laws bore the mark of his age. He punished crimes with severity, sometimes with death, sometimes with brutal penalties that remind us how far the empire still was from gentler ways. He sought to strengthen the army, to secure taxes, to maintain order. He was no utopian dreamer, but a ruler balancing power, tradition, and the new influence of Christian teaching. His laws were a bridge between old Rome and new Christendom, between a pagan past and a future yet to be shaped. Consider how these laws must have felt to ordinary people. A craftsman in a small town who once worked every day without pause now found one day set aside for rest, a day when he could gather with fellow believers without fear. A young mother, once pressured to abandon her child, now found new protections that gave her courage to raise her infant. A slave, beaten cruelly, fled into a church and clung to the altar, knowing the bishop could plead for his life. A widow, once overlooked, received bread from the church treasury, given in the emperor's name. These were small things, perhaps, but they changed lives. And for the Christians, these reforms spoke of more than politics. They were signs that the empire itself was being reshaped by the hand of God. Where once emperors had burned scriptures, now they wrote laws that echoed scripture's mercy. Where once rulers had mocked the cross, now they honored the day of the resurrection. Where once faith had been a crime, now it was a guide for justice. Of course, not all rejoiced. Traditionalists muttered that Rome was losing its ancient ways, that the gods were neglected, that softness would weaken the people. Some resented the church's growing influence, the bishop's new authority, the exemptions granted to clergy. Constantine himself walked carefully, never abolishing the old outright, but step by step turning the empire toward the new. His laws were not revolutions, but gentle tilts, slow shifts, subtle turns. Yet over time, these turns would reshape the world. Constantine the Lawgiver stands as a reminder that power is not only seen on battlefields or in basilicas. It is seen in the quiet decrees that shape daily life, in the rhythm of weeks, in the care of children, in the treatment of slaves, in the rights of the poor. Through these laws, Constantine carried the cross not only into battle, but into the marketplace, the courtroom, and the home. And so, as we picture him not on a horse at Milvian Bridge, nor in white robes at Nicaea, but at a desk with scrolls and scribes, dictating laws to reshape society, we see another side of his reign. A side less dramatic, perhaps, but no less enduring. For battles are won and lost, basilicas rise and fall, but laws change the patterns of life, the habits of generations, the soul of a people. Constantine's laws were not perfect, but they pointed forward. They pointed to a world where the weak mattered, where families were protected, where rest was honored, where mercy had a place beside justice. They pointed to a world shaped not only by the might of Rome, but by the teachings of Christ. This was Constantine the Lawgiver. And through his laws, the empire itself began to change, not only in its faith, but in its daily life. Among all Constantine's acts, his victories, his laws, his patronage of the church, few were as bold or as lasting as the founding of a new city. For centuries, Rome had been the heart of empire, the eternal city, the center of power. But by the 4th century, its glory was fading. Its streets were crowded,
its politics tangled, its position far from the troubled frontiers. Constantine saw the need for a new capital, a new Rome, and he built it with vision and determination. It would stand on the Bosporus, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia. Its name would be Constantinople. The site he chose was ancient. It had once been a Greek colony called Byzantium, a city perched on a peninsula surrounded by water on three sides, its harbours deep and safe, its position commanding the routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Traders had long known its value. Armies had long contested it. But under Constantine, it would become something greater, the capital of a Christian empire. Imagine the scene as the work began. Labourers by the thousands poured into the city. Hammers rang against stone, saws rasped through timber, carts creaked under loads of marble, walls rose higher, towers took shape, streets were laid out in wide, straight lines. The sound of construction echoed day and night. Where once a modest city stood, now an imperial capital began to rise. Constantine planned it with grandeur. He built palaces for rulers, forums for the people, baths, theatres and markets. He laid out broad avenues that cut across the peninsula, lined with colonnades and statues. He raised new walls stretching across the land to guard the city from attack. He created harbours to welcome fleets, docks to serve merchants, granaries to feed the population. The city was not only beautiful, it was strong. But at its heart stood something new. Constantine filled the city with Christian churches. Where Rome had been crowned with temples to Jupiter and Mars, Constantinople was crowned with basilicas to Christ and his saints. The cross, not the eagle, became the symbol of the city. The emperor himself placed relics within its walls, relics said to include fragments of the true cross, the nails of the crucifixion, even the palladium, the old talisman once believed to protect Troy and then Rome. By these gestures, he bound the new city not only to history, but to destiny. When the city was dedicated in 330, it was celebrated with splendor. Constantine himself led the procession. Games were held in the hippodrome, chariots thundering around the track, crowds cheering, banners flying. Prayers were offered not to the old gods, but to Christ. Statues gleamed, buildings shone, music filled the air. The emperor declared the city the new Rome, equal in dignity, greater in purpose, chosen for a new age. For the Christians of the empire, this was a wonder. The old Rome had been a place of martyrs, where Peter and Paul had died, where persecution had struck again and again. Now a new Rome rose, dedicated openly to their faith. Constantinople was not built upon bloodshed and fear, but upon vision and hope. It was a city where Christ was honored, where basilicas stood in the sun, where the emperor himself walked as protector of the church. Let us picture the daily life of Constantinople in its early years. Traders filled the markets with goods from east and west, spices from Arabia, silk from Persia, grain from Egypt, fish from the Black Sea. Sailors crowded the harbours, their ships rocking gently as goods were loaded and unloaded. Children ran through the streets, playing beneath columns carved with images of saints and emperors. Monks walked in quiet processions, chanting psalms, their voices echoing against the walls of basilicas. In the hippodrome, crowds roared as horses thundered past, banners of the blues and greens snapping in the wind. And above it all, in his palace, Constantine watched, knowing he had built not just a city, but a legacy. The symbolism of Constantinople was powerful. It stood on the meeting point of continents, bridging east and west. It guarded the seas, controlled the trade, commanded the armies, and it proclaimed to all who entered its gates that the empire had turned a corner. Rome had once been pagan, but Constantinople was Christian.
Rome had once persecuted, but Constantinople protected. Rome had once seemed eternal, but Constantinople would endure for 1,000 years more, a beacon of faith and power. For Constantine, this was more than politics. It was destiny. He believed that the God who had given him victory at the Milvian bridge, who had guided him at Nicaea, who had blessed his building of Basilicas, was now guiding him to raise a new capital. The old had passed, the new had come. The eternal city of Rome still stood, but the empire's future now looked east to Constantinople. In time, the city would become a jewel of the world. Its domes and spires would shine in the sun. Its libraries would preserve wisdom. Its walls would withstand sieges. Its basilicas would echo with prayer. Generations would know it as the heart of Christendom, the guardian of faith, the seat of emperors. But in Constantine's day, it was still new, its streets fresh, its stones unweathered, its promise unfulfilled. And yet, even then, its meaning was clear. By founding Constantinople, Constantine declared that the empire itself had been reborn. No longer centered on the old ways, it now stood upon new ground, dedicated to a new faith, built for a new age. The city on the Bosporus was more than stone and marble. It was a symbol of change, of vision, of the future. This was Constantine the builder once more, but now not only of basilicas, but of a city that would carry his name, his faith, and his legacy for centuries to come. For all his victories, for all his laws, for all his building of basilicas and founding of cities, one question has lingered across the centuries. What of Constantine's own faith? He raised the cross above his armies, he honored bishops, he favored the church, yet he was not baptized until the very end of his life. What then was the nature of his conversion? Was he truly a Christian emperor, or was he only a patron, guided by politics more than by piety? To answer, we must walk carefully, slowly, and see him not only as an emperor, but as a man. Constantine grew up in a world shaped by the old gods. In his youth he saw temples filled with incense, sacrifices offered to Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo. He watched emperors demand honor as divine, saw rituals and ceremonies woven into the very fabric of Roman life. To turn from all this was not a small thing. It meant not only a change of faith, but a change of identity, of loyalty, of heritage. And yet, from the moment of his vision before the Milvian bridge, Constantine carried the cross as his sign. He placed it upon the shields of his soldiers, raised it on his standards, and marched beneath it into victory. To him, this was no accident. It was the mark of a God who had given him triumph, a God who had chosen him, a God who had shown power greater than any idol of stone. From that time onward, Constantine favored the church openly. He gave it wealth, protection, and honor. He spoke of Christ in his letters, calling him the Savior and the highest God. He ordered prayers to be made in Christ's name, carried relics into his city, and sought the advice of bishops. He did not hide his devotion. The cross became not only a symbol of victory, but of his reign. And yet, he was not baptized. Why? In part, this reflected the customs of the time. Many delayed baptism until late in life, believing it washed away all sins committed before. To be baptized too early, they feared, was to risk falling again into sin without forgiveness. Constantine, as emperor, bore heavy responsibilities. Wars to fight, judgments to give, punishments to decree. Perhaps he felt that baptism, so holy, should be reserved for the moment when he could lay down the sword, when his life neared its end. But there was also caution in him. He never outlawed the old gods completely. Temples still stood. Sacrifices were still permitted. Old rituals continued. He moved step by step. never forcing conversion, never demanding that all follow Christ. He honored the new faith, but he did not destroy the old overnight. In this, perhaps, he acted as a ruler more than as a disciple, balancing tradition and change, guiding the empire gently, not breaking it suddenly. Still, his devotion deepened. He prayed often, he studied the scriptures, he sought the council of bishops like Eusebius of Caesarea. He called himself a servant of the one true God. He built churches not as ornaments, but as testimonies of faith. He spoke of Christ not as one God among many, but as Lord. For Constantine, faith and empire were woven together. His victories, his laws, his city, his councils all flowed from the conviction that Christ had guided him, that Christ sustained him, that Christ was his protector. At last, in the year 337, as his life drew to a close, Constantine fell ill. He knew his end was near, and so, at a villa near Nicomedia, he called for baptism. Stripped of the purple robes of an emperor, he dressed in simple white. The man who had once commanded armies, who had sat upon golden thrones, now stood humbly as a penitent, ready to receive the waters of rebirth. Bishops gathered, prayers were spoken, water was poured. Constantine, the emperor of Rome, the founder of Constantinople, the victor of battles, was baptized in the name of Christ. Accounts tell us that after his baptism, he refused to wear the imperial purple again. He lived his final days as a baptized man, clothed in white, praying, seeking peace, preparing for the life to come. On May the 22nd, 337, he died. His body was carried to Constantinople, and there he was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles, surrounded by symbols of the 12, as though he himself stood among them. So what are we to make of Constantine's faith? Was it real or was it convenient? Was he a true believer or a shrewd politician? Historians have debated for centuries, but perhaps the answer is both simpler and deeper. He was a man in transition, living in a world in transition. He was raised in the old but chosen for the new. He bore the habits of Rome, but he carried the cross of Christ. He hesitated, he balanced, he delayed, but in the end he bowed. For the Church, Constantine's baptism was a symbol. The first emperor to favor Christ had died as a Christian. The man who once wore the purple now wore the white of the baptized. The empire itself, once the persecutor, now seemed itself baptized, cleansed, reborn. And for us, as we look back, we see in Constantine's faith both greatness and struggle. Greatness in that he honored Christ, lifted the church, built its halls, called its councils, and carried its cross. Struggle in that he hesitated, delayed, and balanced between old and new. Yet perhaps that very struggle makes him human. He was not a saint untouched by doubt, but a man shaped by history, learning slowly, step by step, what it meant to follow Christ. This was Constantine's conversion and baptism, a journey long delayed, but at last fulfilled. A confession whispered at the end of life, but strong enough to echo through the centuries. The emperor who had conquered by the cross now died in the cross, and in doing so gave his final testimony, that Christ was Lord, not only of soldiers and cities, but of emperors and kings, of life and of death. When Constantine breathed his last in the spring of 337, the empire entered a new chapter. His body, clothed in white after baptism, was carried to the city he had built, Constantinople, and laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles. There, amid the symbols of the 12, his tomb stood as though he himself were numbered among the apostles, a 13th witness to Christ. His reign was over, but his legacy had only begun. To speak of Constantine's legacy is to speak of a turning point in history. For 3 centuries, Christianity had been a faith of the margins, persecuted, mistrusted, confined to homes and catacombs. Now, under Constantine, it had stepped into the light. The cross, once a sign of shame, was lifted as a banner of victory. The church, once hunted, now flourished. The emperor himself had bowed before Christ, and the empire itself was forever changed. His legacy can be seen first in the church. Constantine gave it freedom, protection, and honor. He restored its property, funded its buildings, exempted its clergy, and raised its bishops to positions of influence. He called councils to settle disputes, most famously at Nicaea, and gave unity to a faith threatened by division. He made Christianity not only tolerated but central, weaving it into the very fabric of public life. From his reign onward, the church was no longer only a community of believers, it was a partner in shaping society. But Constantine's legacy reached beyond the church. He was a reformer, a lawgiver, a builder. His decrees reshaped family life, softened the harshness of slavery, gave dignity to the poor, and set aside Sunday as a day of rest. His basilicas rose across the empire, in Rome, Jerusalem, Constantinople, Antioch, visible signs of a new era. His city of Constantinople stood as a Christian capital, guarding the empire for 1,000 years, its domes and walls a beacon to east and west alike. Through these acts, Constantine's mark was etched not only in stone but in the habits of daily life, in the rhythms of weeks, in the prayers of generations. His legacy, however, was not without complexity. Some later critics said he blurred the line between church and state, drawing bishops too close to emperors. Others noted that he delayed baptism, that he balanced between the old gods and the new faith, that he acted at times with the caution of a politician rather than the zeal of a saint. Some saw in him the birth of a Constantinian shift, where the church gained power but risked its purity. These questions would echo through centuries, debated by theologians, historians, and believers alike. Yet for all this, Constantine's place in history is undeniable. He ended the persecution of Christians. He gave them space to breathe, to grow, to flourish. He turned the empire toward Christ, not with sudden destruction of the old, but with steady favor for the new. He founded a city that would outlast the empire itself, a city that would become the heart of Christendom for a millennium. He shaped law, society, and worship in ways that endure even today. Think of the cross upon his standards. Before Constantine, the cross was a sign of execution, a mark of humiliation, a symbol of weakness. After Constantine, it became the banner of victory, the emblem of emperors, the sign of salvation honored across the world. His vision before the Milvian bridge did not only change one battle, it changed the way the cross itself was seen. That transformation, more than any law or building, is his greatest legacy. Let us also remember the ordinary lives touched by his reign. A child spared because infanticide was discouraged. A slave who found refuge at an altar. A widow fed from church charity, supported by imperial funds. A craftsman who laid down his tools on Sunday, resting with his family, worshipping without fear. A pilgrim who walked into a basilica in Jerusalem, lit by Constantine's gifts, and prayed where Christ had risen. These lives, countless and unseen, were shaped by the decisions of one emperor. And let us picture his city, Constantinople, in centuries to come. Its walls would withstand sieges, its churches would echo with hymns, its scholars would preserve ancient wisdom, its emperors would continue his legacy. When Rome itself fell to barbarian invasions, Constantinople endured, carrying the flame of the empire, carrying the faith of Christ. For 1,000 years, travelers would enter its gates and know it as the New Rome, the city of Constantine, the capital of a Christian world. Was Constantine a saint? Some churches honor him as one, others hesitate. Was he a true believer? His baptism at the end, his prayers, his generosity suggest sincerity, yet his caution and delay leave questions. Was he a shrewd politician? Certainly. He knew how to balance, how to guide, how to secure loyalty. But perhaps he was all of these at once: believer, ruler, reformer, builder, politician, patron. A man caught between two worlds, the old Rome of temples and idols, and the new Christendom of basilicas and crosses. In the end, Constantine's legacy is not found in perfection, but in transformation. He did not end every cruelty. He did not resolve every dispute. He did not erase every trace of the old. But he turned the empire toward a new horizon. He gave the church a future. He gave the cross a crown. He gave the world a city that bore his name. Through him, history itself shifted. So let us remember him not only as the conqueror at the Milvian bridge, nor only as the patron of bishops at Nicaea, nor only as the founder of Constantinople, nor only as the man baptized in white at the end of his days. Let us remember him as the bridge between eras, the hinge of history, the emperor who carried the empire from the age of many gods into the age of the one God. This was Constantine's legacy, and it endures still. In every church that recites the Nicene Creed, in every Sunday set apart for worship, in every cross that stands not as a mark of shame, but as a sign of salvation,